It was a Thursday afternoon, overcast and humid, the kind of day where everything feels heavy and sluggish. When my brother called, his voice crackled through the static, sounding urgent but subdued, a tone he used when he was about to drop something serious. "You heard about Cedric Roberts, right?" Andreas asked. There was no greeting, no preamble. I shifted in my chair, looking out the window of my small office. The view was nothing special, just the cluttered cityscape, where the horizon was obscured by a mix of dull, gray buildings and endless power lines. Nothing about that day had prepared me for the name Andreas mentioned. Cedric Roberts. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. "The guy who killed his family, drove them into a train, right?" "That's him," Andreas said. "But it's not what you think. It's not what anyone thinks." I frowned, leaning forward in my chair, suddenly more alert. "What do you mean?" Andreas hesitated, and I could hear the faint tapping of his fingers on his desk, something he did when he was nervous. Cedric didn't kill his family out of insanity, or at least that's what he says. He claims he was following rules given to him by something called Tall Crawl. The name alone sent a chill down my spine, though I didn't know why. Tall Crawl? What the hell is that supposed to be? My brother sighed, and I could almost see him rubbing his temples on the other end of the line. "I don't know, man. It's some kind of entity, or at least that's what Cedric believes. But here's the kicker, he says these rules weren't just in his head. He says if he didn't follow them, bad things would happen." I sat there in silence for a moment, trying to process what Andreas was telling me. I had dealt with strange stories before, but this was different. Felt wrong, like something that should have stayed buried in whispers, never to be spoken aloud. "I've been in touch with someone at the psychiatric hospital where Cedric's being held," Andreas continued. "She thinks he's willing to talk. He hasn't spoken to the media since his arrest, but for some reason, he's agreed to meet you, if you're up for it." I paused, tapping my fingers on the desk now, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to say no, to stay as far away from this as possible. But the other part, the journalist in me, was intrigued. This was the kind of story that could change everything. It wasn't just sensational, it was the kind of mystery that gnaws at you, demands to be unraveled. "Okay," I finally said. "Set it up." 3 days later, I found myself driving out to the psychiatric facility where Cedric Roberts had been incarcerated. The road was long, winding through dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The sky was overcast again, the same oppressive gray that had been hanging over the city for days, casting everything in a dull, muted light. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a kind of gnawing unease, the kind you feel when you know you're heading towards something you don't fully understand. The psychiatric hospital came into view suddenly, rising up out of the trees like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The building was old, with large, barred windows and walls stained by decades of rain and neglect. It stood isolated, a monument to the broken minds it housed, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. I parked my car in the small, gravel lot and sat there for a moment, staring at the building. There was a weight in the air, something thick and palpable, as if the very ground beneath the hospital was soaked with the despair of its inhabitants. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front entrance. Inside, the hospital was just as grim as it looked from the outside. The walls were a sickly yellow, the floors scuffed and worn from years of neglect. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, but underneath that was something else. A stale, musty odor that clung to everything. A nurse led me down a series of long, narrow corridors, each one more dismal than the last, until we reached Cedric's room. Cedric Roberts sat cross-legged on the bed, his back unnaturally straight, hands resting on his knees like a meditating monk. But there was nothing peaceful about the man. His eyes were too wide, too bright, and they locked onto me the moment I stepped into the room. "Nice to meet you, Cedric," I said, keeping my tone light. Cedric's lips twitched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're here for the rules," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, taking a seat in the chair opposite his bed. "I'm here to understand. You've said some things that don't make sense to a lot of people. I'd like to hear your side of the story." For a long moment, Cedric just stared at me, his eyes boring into mine like he could see straight through me. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, but I warn you, once you know the rules, you can't unknow them. They'll stick to you like tar, and you'll never be free of them." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I forced a smile. "I'll take my chances." And then he told me, "Rule number 1, Cedric began, his voice calm but with an unsettling edge. "Do whatever he bids, and do it twice if you doubt yourself." He paused, watching me carefully for a reaction, but I said nothing, just scribbled the rule down in my notebook. Rule number 2, walk no fewer than 11 steps per hour. Again, I wrote it down, my mind trying to make sense of what I was hearing. These weren't the ramblings of a madman. They were something else, something far more deliberate. Rule number 3, never walk in the shade of a backwards tree. I frowned at that one, glancing up at Cedric. "What's a backwards tree?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll know one when you see it." Rule number 4, no artificial light between 1 and 6 in the morning. I couldn't help but shake my head slightly. "And the last one?" Cedric's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "Snap the bird when it sings." The room seemed to grow colder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You mean, kill it?" Cedric nodded slowly. "If you don't, Tall Crawl will come for you." For a long time, I just sat there, staring at him. His face was calm, serene even, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke. Like he wasn't just reciting rules, he was warning me. "And you believe these rules keep you safe?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Cedric's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Not just me. They'll keep you safe too, but you have to follow them. Kai, if you break the rules, you'll find out what happens." I left the hospital that day feeling uneasy, but I told myself it was just another strange interview with another disturbed patient. I had met plenty of people like Cedric before, people whose minds had fractured under the weight of their own delusions. This was no different. At least, that's what I told myself. But as the days passed, I found it harder and harder to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It started small, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. And then the dreams began. Every night, I dreamed of the same thing, a tall, shadowy figure with long limbs and hollow eyes, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was suffocating. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the feeling of being watched lingering long after I opened my eyes. And then there were the rules. First, I ignored them. They were just the ramblings of a madman, after all. But the more I tried to dismiss them, the more they seemed to invade my thoughts. I found myself counting my steps without meaning to, avoiding patches of shade, and waking up in the middle of the night, terrified that I had left a light on.